The 21st of May 1940, 14:32 hours, near Arras, northern France. The German gunner had done everything right. He had waited until the range closed to 300 meters. He had steadied his breathing. He had placed his crosshair centermass on the slow-moving shape emerging from the wheat fields, that strange low silhouette that looked nothing like the French tanks his training manuals had shown him. He squeezed the trigger. The 37mm anti-tank round struck steel. There was a spark. A sound like a hammer dropped on a cathedral bell. Then nothing. The tank kept coming. He fired again, and again, and again. Each round struck home. Each round bounced away, tumbling into the French soil like spent dice, harmless and strange. The tank did not stop. It did not slow. It simply continued forward, that long dark barrel rising slightly as its tracks crushed the summer wheat flat. Feldwebel Heinrich Müller would later write in his diary, "We hit it 17 times. 17. I counted each one. It was like throwing stones at a locomotive." On that spring afternoon, in the rolling farmland south of Arras, the German army encountered something it had not prepared for, something that violated the assumptions of every tactical manual, every training exercise, every confident speech about the invincibility of German arms. They encountered a machine that would not die when it was supposed to die. The British called it the Infantry Tank Mark II. History would remember it as the Matilda, and the war would never feel quite the same after it arrived. The first thing the German anti-tank crews noticed was the sound, not the roar of a powerful engine. The Matilda was almost languid in its approach, its twin diesel engine producing a low, industrial hum rather than the aggressive growl of a Panzer. No, what struck them was the silence between their shots and their impacts. The fraction of a second when the shell was in flight, when hope lived, when their training told them the enemy would soon be burning. Then the clang, that awful, hollow clang. Private Werner Schultz was 19 years old, crewing a 3.7 centimeters Pak 36 anti-tank gun with the 7th Panzer Division. He had been in Poland. He had watched that same gun tear through Polish armor like scissors through cardboard. He had believed, with a conviction of youth and victory, that German engineering was simply superior, that their weapons were designed to win. The Matilda changed his mind in 11 seconds. "We saw it come over the rise," he would tell an interviewer decades later, his hands still steady, his eyes still troubled by the memory. "Like a turtle, slow, patient. We opened fire at 400 meters. Good range, clear shot, and the round just sparkled. That's the only word. It sparkled against the armor and fell away." He fired 5 more times. Same result. Then the turret turned toward us. Schultz survived because his gun commander had the wisdom to run. Others were not so fortunate. Up and down the German line that afternoon, anti-tank crews discovered a terrible truth. Their primary weapon against enemy armor was useless. The 3.7 centimeters Pak 36, the gun they had trained on, trusted, celebrated. It could not penetrate British armor. Not at 400 meters. Not at 300. Not at point-blank range. The Matilda's frontal armor was 78 millimeters thick. Some sections exceeded that. The 37mm shell, traveling at muzzle velocity, could penetrate perhaps 30 millimeters of armor at standard combat ranges. The mathematics was simple and devastating. The shell had no chance. If this moment already changed how you see the war, subscribe, because what German commanders did next would alter the entire trajectory of armored warfare. To understand why German guns couldn't kill the Matilda, you have to understand why the Matilda existed at all. The British approach to tank design in the 1930s was divided into 2 philosophies, 2 competing visions of what armor should do in modern war. There were cruiser tanks, fast, lightly armored vehicles meant to exploit breakthroughs, chase retreating enemies, and operate like cavalry of old. And there were infantry tanks, slow, heavily protected machines designed to do one thing extremely well: survive. The Matilda II was the purest expression of the infantry tank philosophy. It was not built to race across open country. It was built to walk beside soldiers, absorbing punishment, crushing obstacles, and delivering close-range firepower against fortifications and defensive positions. Its designers assumed it would face enemy fire constantly. They assumed every anti-tank gun in Europe would be aimed at it. So they gave it armor that could stop them all. The man most responsible was Captain Samuel Ninnis Richardson, working at the Royal Arsenal, Woolwich, in the mid-1930s. He understood something his German counterparts did not. The next war will be decided not by who could move fastest, but by who could endure the longest. He looked at the anti-tank weapons then in service, the French 37mm, the German 37mm, even the British 2-pounder, and he designed armor to defeat all of them. The Matilda's hull was constructed from cast sections bolted together, creating a thick, rounded shell that deflected shots naturally. The turret was cast as a single piece, eliminating weak points at the seams. The tracks were protected by heavy skates. The driver sat behind an armored visor that could stop machine gun fire at close range. We wanted a tank that could walk through fire, one engineer noted, and we built one. By September 1939, when Britain declared war on Germany, approximately 30 Matilda I's had been delivered to the British Army. By May 1940, the number had grown to 139, distributed among various battalions. It was not enough to win the war, but it was enough to shock those who thought they already had. The Matildas that arrived in France came by sea, crossing the channel in the holds of transport ships, their crews seasick and anxious, their machines wrapped in canvas against the salt spray. They arrived at ports like Cherbourg and Le Havre, then rumbled south and east on railway flat cows, the French countryside passing in a blur of green fields and stone villages that seemed impossibly peaceful for a continent at war. Inside the tanks, conditions were cramped, hot, and filled with the sharp smell of oil, cordite, and human sweat. The Matilda was designed for 4 men, commander, gunner, loader, and driver. Each had his station, his role, his narrow slice of armored space. Communication was difficult. The intercom crackled with static, and the noise of the engines made conversation almost impossible. Hand signals became essential. A tap on the shoulder meant stop. A pointed finger meant there. Private Thomas Hartley, a loader in the 7th Royal Tank Regiment, kept a small notebook in his breast pocket. His entries from that period are terse, practical, almost businesslike. May 18th. Arrived at assembly area. Tank running rough. Tracks need adjustment. Received rations. Tinned beef again. No word on when we move. May 20th. Briefing tonight. Sounds like counterattack. The officers look worried. I trust the tank. May 21st. Today we fight. The counterattack that followed was known as the Battle of Arras, one of the few offensive operations mounted by British forces during the disastrous fall of France. The plan was simple in conception, desperate in execution. 2 columns of tanks, accompanied by infantry, would strike south into the flank of the advancing German forces, disrupt their supply lines, and by time for the Allied retreat to Dunkirk. The southern column consisted largely of Matilda tanks, some markers armed only with machine guns, others the heavier Mark I's with their 2-pounder guns. They moved out in the early afternoon, crossing farmland that had known peace for 20 years, and within hours they encountered the forward elements of the 7th Panzer Division. The division was commanded by a general named Rommel. He was about to learn a lesson he would never forget. The first German unit to encounter the Matildas was SS Division Totenkopf, positioned near the village of Whaley. Their anti-tank platoon opened fire at long range, confident in their weapons, certain that the British tanks would burn. The tanks did not burn. I watched my gunners hit the same tank 6 times, one German officer later recalled. Each time, the shell bounced. The crew began to panic. They thought the tanks were supernatural. Within minutes, the anti-tank platoon had been overrun. The Matildas crushed guns, scattered crews, and pushed into the rear areas where trucks, supply wagons, and starved vehicles were clustered. Chaos spread. Word went up the chain of command. The British had invincible tanks. Rommel received the reports with disbelief, then fury. He was not a man who accepted impossible situations. He drove forward personally, reaching a position near Whaley where he could see the action firsthand. What he witnessed would shape his tactical thinking for the rest of the war. The Matildas were not fast. They moved at perhaps 8 miles per hour across the fields, but they were methodical, implacable. They advanced in loose formation, their turrets traversing to engage targets of opportunity, their machine guns chattering at infantry who fled before them. German soldiers, veterans of Poland, men who had never retreated, were running. They came on like ships, one German soldier wrote. Nothing could touch them. We fired and they kept coming. Rommel's response was improvised, brilliant, and brutal. He recognized that his standard anti-tank weapons were useless, so he turned to the one gun in his arsenal capable of penetrating the Matilda's armor, the 8.8 centimeters Flak 36, the famous 88. The 88 millimeters was an anti-aircraft gun designed to destroy bombers at high altitude. It was never meant for use against ground targets, but it fired a heavy shell at extremely high velocity, and velocity, Rommel knew, was a key to penetrating armor. He ordered every available 88 brought forward, positioned in ambush, aimed at the oncoming British tanks. The first Matilda to encounter an 88 was struck through the turret at approximately 600 meters. The shell punched through the armor that had stopped everything else, detonated inside, and killed the entire crew instantly. The tank did not burn at first. It simply stopped, smoke curling from the hatches, and then the ammunition began to cook off in a series of dull, muffled explosions. Other Matildas followed. The 88s could kill them, but there were not many 88s, and the Matildas were everywhere. The Battle of Arras ended inconclusively. The British forces withdrew after inflicting significant casualties and capturing several hundred prisoners. They had not achieved their strategic objectives, but they had done something more important. They had demonstrated that German invincibility was a myth. The day we proved immortal. That was how Sergeant William Clark, a tank commander in the 4th Royal Tank Regiment, described Arras in his post-war memoir. They thought they couldn't be stopped. We showed them otherwise. The psychological impact of Arras extended far beyond the battlefield. German intelligence reports from the following days revealed genuine concern about British armor capabilities. One assessment, prepared for the High Command, noted that the standard 37mm anti-tank gun was completely inadequate against the Matilda and recommended immediate development of heavier alternatives. In his personal diary, Rommel wrote, "Very heavy fighting with the British tanks. They moved through our lines as if our anti-tank guns did not exist. We stopped them only with the 88mm. We must have more such guns." The directive that followed changed German tactical doctrine. From that point forward, the 88mm would be deployed not just against aircraft but against tanks. Crews would be trained in dual-role operations. New carriages would be developed to improve the gun's mobility against ground targets. The 88 would become the most feared anti-tank weapon of the war. But none of that happened overnight. And in the month that followed, as the German army consolidated its victory in France and turned its attention to other theaters, the Matilda continued to exact its toll. The desert received the Matilda in December 1940, when the first tanks arrived in Egypt as part of a desperately needed reinforcement for British forces facing Italian invasion from Libya. The 7th Armored Division, the famous Desert Rats, integrated the new tanks into their order of battle with a mixture of hope and skepticism. The desert was unforgiving terrain for armored vehicles. Sand clogged air filters. Heat warped metal and boiled coolant. Tracks wore down at twice the normal rate. The Matilda, designed for European conditions, had to prove itself all over again in an environment that seemed designed to destroy machinery. But it did prove itself, because in the desert, as in France, the enemy could not kill it. The Italian army in Libya possessed anti-tank weapons comparable to the German 37mm, in many cases, identical licensed copies. When Operation Compass began on December 9, 1940, British forces attacked Italian defensive positions at Sidi Barni with a combination of infantry, artillery, and tanks. The Matildas led the assault. Italian gunners opened fire at ranges of 300, 200, 100 meters. The shells struck, sparked, and fell away. The Matildas kept coming. By nightfall, the Italian positions had been overrun, and the retreat that followed would not stop until the British had advanced 500 miles, capturing 130,000 prisoners and destroying an army. "The Italians call us the tank that cannot be destroyed," wrote Corporal James Morrison, a driver with the 4th Armored Brigade. "I'm not sure if it's a compliment or a curse. Either way, I'll take it." The Matilda's reputation grew with every engagement. At Bardia, at Tobruk, at Beta-Fom, the tanks proved decisive. Italian soldiers, many of whom had never been told that such vehicles existed, surrendered in droves rather than face armor they could not fight. The psychological impact was as significant as the physical damage. One Italian prisoner, interviewed after his capture at Tobruk, said simply, "We shot it. We shot it many times. It laughed at us." The success of the Matilda was not merely a function of its armor. It was a function of engineering philosophy, a choice made by British designers that prioritized protection over mobility, endurance over aggression. Understanding this philosophy requires understanding the men who built the tank and the lessons they drew from the previous war. The First World War had demonstrated the lethal efficiency of defensive firepower. Machine guns, artillery, and trenches had turned the Western Front into a killing ground where attackers died by the hundreds of thousands for gains measured in yards. The tank had been invented specifically to break this deadlock, to create a mobile armored platform that could cross no man's land, absorb defensive fire, and deliver infantry to the enemy trench lines. British tank doctrine in the interwar years remained rooted in this experience. The infantry tank was conceived not as a weapon of pursuit, but as a weapon of assault. It would move at the pace of walking soldiers. It would provide them with mobile cover. And above all, it would not be stopped by the anti-tank guns that every army was developing. The 78 millimeters of frontal armor on the Matilda II was the answer to a specific question: how thick must armor be to stop every standard anti-tank round at typical engagement ranges? British engineers tested, calculated, and experimented. They knew the performance characteristics of German, French, Italian, and Soviet anti-tank weapons. They designed the Matilda to defeat them all. This was not arrogance. It was mathematics. The cast steel from which the Matilda was constructed came from foundries in Sheffield, home of British metallurgy for centuries. The alloys used had been refined through decades of naval shipbuilding, battleship armor adapted for tanks. Quality control was rigorous. Each section was tested for hardness, for consistency, for the ability to absorb and distribute the energy of an impact without cracking or spalling. "We built her to take punishment," one factory supervisor recalled. Every plate, every seam, every rivet, checked and checked again. The lads knew their work would save lives. The result was a tank that weighed nearly 27 tons, heavy foot size, slow because of that weight, but nearly impervious to anything the enemy could throw at it. The trade-off was acceptable. The Matilda was not designed to race panzers across open country. It was designed to survive. The daily reality for Matilda crews in North Africa was a mixture of tedium, discomfort, and sudden violence. The desert stretched infinite and indifferent, a landscape of sand, rock, and dust where landmarks were few and navigation was as much art as science. Tank columns moved in the early morning and late afternoon, when temperatures were merely brutal rather than lethal. During the midday hours, crews sheltered in the shade of their vehicles, rationing water, playing cards, writing letters that might or might not reach home. Inside the tank, conditions were severe. The steel hull absorbed heat like an oven. Temperatures inside a Matilda at noon could exceed 120 degrees Fahrenheit. Crews stripped to shorts and boots, their skin coated with a mixture of sweat, oil, and fine desert dust at work into every pore. The smell was indescribable, mechanical and human, metallic and organic. "You get used to it," wrote Corporal Edward Barnes in a letter to his wife. "You get used to everything, eventually. The heat, the sand, the noise. You stop noticing. Or maybe you just stop caring." Maintenance was constant and essential. The desert was merciless on machinery. Air filters clogged hourly, requiring the driver to stop, dismount, and beat the filter clean against the hull. Tracks stretched and loosened, pins working free, links threatening to separate at the worst possible moment. The twin diesel engines, unusual for British tanks, which typically used petrol, ran hot and demanded careful attention to coolant levels and oil pressure. But the armor held. Always, the armor held. Trooper Michael Brennan, 22 years old, from Manchester, served as a gunner in a Matilda during the siege of Tobruk in 1941. His unit participated in sorties against the surrounding German and Italian forces, probing attacks designed to keep the enemy off balance while the garrison prepared its defenses. He kept a diary throughout the siege, small entries written in pencil on whatever paper he could find. April 14th. Sortie at dawn. Engaged enemy column on Coast Road. They fired at us for 20 minutes. I counted at least 40 hits. Not one penetrated. We destroyed 2 trucks and a gun before withdrawing. Tea afterwards never tasted better. April 29th. New lad joined the crew today. Loader. Scared stiff. I told him the armor would protect him. He didn't believe me until we took fire that afternoon. Then he understood. May 6th. Heard rumors the Germans have new guns. Bigger, faster. Not sure what to believe. The tank has kept us alive this long. I trust her. The rumors Brennan heard were true. The German army was adapting. After the shock of Arras, German weapons development had accelerated dramatically. The 50mm Pak 38 anti-tank gun entered service in mid-1940, offering significantly improved penetration over the older 37mm. More importantly, the 88mm flak gun was being systematically redeployed as a dual-purpose weapon with specialized anti-tank ammunition and improved mobility carriages. In North Africa, Rommel, now commanding the Afrika Corps, brought these lessons with him. He had faced a Matilda at Arras. He respected it, and he had no intention of being surprised again. The first major engagement where German countermeasures proved effective came at Hellfire Pass in June 1941, during Operation Battle Axe, a British offensive intended to relieve Tobruk and push the Germans back into Libya. Rommel had fortified the pass with 88mm guns, dug in and camouflaged, their crews trained specifically to engage heavy armor. The Matildas came forward in the morning light, confident in their invincibility. At 2,000 meters, far beyond effective range for their own 2-pounder guns, the 88s opened fire. The result was catastrophic. The first tank was hit and stopped, recorded 1 British officer. Then the second, then the third. We could not see where the fire was coming from. We could not reply. We could only burn. Of the 12 Matildas that advanced into the pass that morning, 11 were destroyed. The battle earned Hellfire Pass a grim nickname among British soldiers, Hellfire Pass. The Matilda's era of invincibility was ending, but the tank was not finished yet. If you're seeing this war in a new light, subscribe, because the story of what the Matilda meant to the men inside it is even more remarkable than the battles it fought. The shift in German capabilities did not make the Matilda irrelevant. It made the tank survival a matter of tactics rather than assumptions. Crews learned to use terrain, to approach from unexpected angles, to avoid the kill zones where 88s waited. The armor that had once stopped everything now required cunning to complement its strength. Captain Harold Jennings, a troop commander with the 44th Royal Tank Regiment, developed what he called the chess approach to armored warfare. He would study the ground before every engagement, identifying dead zones, hold-down positions, and routes that kept his tanks below ridgelines and out of long-range fire. He taught his crews to think of the desert as a board, each move calculated, each position chosen for advantage. The tank doesn't change, he told his men, but how we use it must change. We're not invincible anymore, if we ever were, but we're still bloody hard to kill if we're clever about it. His methods worked. His troops sustained lower casualties than any comparable unit, despite being in constant action throughout the desert campaign. The Matilda survived not because the armor was impenetrable. It wasn't, not anymore, but because the crews who operated them learned to make the most of every advantage. This adaptation was mirrored across the British armored forces. Tactics evolved. Doctrine changed. The assumption that heavy armor alone could win battles gave way to a more nuanced understanding of combined arms warfare, where tanks work alongside infantry, artillery, and aircraft in coordinated operations. The Matilda remained in service throughout 1941 and into 1942, gradually supplemented and then replaced by newer designs, the Valentine, the Crusader, and eventually the American Sherman. But the lessons it taught about armor protection, about the psychology of combat, about the relationship between technology and tactics, shaped British tank design for decades to come. Christmas Day, 1941. Tobruk. The siege had been lifted 2 weeks earlier, the Australian and British garrison relieved after 241 days of isolation. The desert around the town was littered with the wreckage of war, burnt-out tanks, abandoned guns, the unburied dead of half a dozen nationalities. But on Christmas morning, the fighting paused. Inside a repair depot on the outskirts of the town, a Matilda sat with its engine cover removed, mechanics working to replace a damaged fuel pump. The tank had been hit twice during the relief operations, once on the turret, once on the hull. Neither shot had penetrated. The crew called her Lucky Lady and had painted the name on her side in white letters, now faded by sun and sand. The crew gathered around their tank that morning, sharing a small Christmas meal assembled from rations and traded goods. There was tinned fruit from Australia, chocolate from a Red Cross parcel, a bottle of whiskey that the commander, Lieutenant David Foster, had been saving for 3 months. To Lucky Lady, Foster said, raising his tin cup, and to getting home. They drank, they ate, they sat in the shade of their tank and did not speak of the battles to come, the friends they had lost, the uncertainty that stretched ahead of them like the desert itself. For one morning, they simply existed, alive, together, protected by 78 millimeters of Sheffield steel. Trooper Brennan wrote in his diary that night, "Christmas in the desert. Not what I imagined, but we're alive, the tank is repaired, and tomorrow we'll fight again. I suppose that's enough. It has to be." The Matilda's final chapter in North Africa came in mid-1942, as the tank was progressively withdrawn from frontline service. The 2-pounder gun that had been adequate in 1940 was now insufficient against newer German tanks, particularly the Panzer III and Panzer IV with their upgraded armor. The slow speed that had once been acceptable became a liability in the fluid, mobile battles that characterized the Desert War. And the 88 millimeters, deployed in ever greater numbers, had stripped away the invincibility that had once made a Matilda fearsome. But the tank did not disappear. It was transferred to secondary roles, infantry support, training, defensive positions, and to other theaters where its characteristics remained valuable. In the Pacific, Matildas equipped Australian forces fighting the Japanese, their heavy armor proving effective against an enemy that possessed few anti-tank weapons of any kind. At the Battle of Bunagana, Matilda supported infantry assaults against fortified Japanese positions, absorbing machine gun fire and destroying bunkers with their 2-pounder guns and hull-mounted machine guns. The Japs didn't know what to make of it, recalled Sergeant Patrick Keane, a tank commander with the Australian 2-6 Armored Regiment. They'd fire at us with everything they had, rifles, machine guns, even swords, for God's sake, and nothing worked. I almost felt sorry for them. Almost. The Pacific Matildas were often equipped with flamethrowers, replacing the hull machine gun with a terrifying weapon that could clear bunkers and caves in seconds. The psychological impact on Japanese defenders was profound. Soldiers who would fight to the death against infantry, who would charge machine guns with bayonets, would flee from the Matilda's jets of liquid fire. It was not a noble weapon, but it was an effective one. By 1945, the Matilda was obsolete. The tank that had been invincible in 1940 was now a relic, outclassed by the new generation of vehicles that the war had produced: the Tiger, the Panther, the Sherman, the T-34. Its armor, once revolutionary, was now merely adequate. Its gun, once sufficient, was now inadequate. Its speed, once acceptable, was now pathetic compared to the fast, powerful tanks that dominated late-war battlefields. But obsolescence was not failure. The Matilda had done what it was designed to do. It had protected its crews, won battles, and bought time for Britain when time was desperately short. The tank that could not be killed had kept men alive long enough for newer weapons, better tactics, and greater numbers to turn the tide. Total production of the Matilda II reached 2,987 tanks, built between 1937 and 1943. They served with British, Australian, New Zealand, and Soviet forces. Approximately 1,084 were sent to the Soviet Union under Lend-Lease, where they fought on the Eastern Front against the same German army that had first encountered them at Arras. Soviet tankers called them slowly advancing tanks and complained about the speed and the gun, but they acknowledged that the armor was excellent. The Germans could not kill it easily, one Soviet tank commander noted. And in war, that is what matters. What remains of the Matilda today are metal hulks in museums, rusting relics in desert sites, and the memory preserved in letters, diaries, and official records. The men who crewed them are mostly gone now, their generation passing into history. But the lessons of the Matilda endure. The tank was built on a simple premise: protection matters. In a world of offensive weapons and aggressive doctrines, the Matilda's designers chose to prioritize survival. They calculated the threat, designed armor to defeat it, and accepted the trade-offs that choice required. The result was a machine that, for 2 critical years, could not be killed by standard enemy weapons. This was not magic. It was engineering. The German army, confronted with a Matilda, adapted. They developed new weapons, new tactics, new doctrines. The 88mm became the foundation of German anti-tank warfare, eventually inspiring the guns that would on the Tiger and Panther tanks. The experience of facing armor they could not penetrate drove innovation that shaped the rest of the war. In this sense, the Matilda changed everything, not by winning the war, but by forcing the enemy to fight differently. The tank that survived against impossible odds became a catalyst for the arms race that would define armored warfare for decades to come. Lieutenant David Foster survived the war. He returned to England in 1945, mustered out of the army, and took a job with an engineering firm in Birmingham. He married, raised children, and lived a quiet life far from the desert battles of his youth. But he kept a single piece of his wartime service, a fragment of armor plate, roughly the size of his palm, with a shallow depression where an anti-tank round had struck and failed to penetrate. Lucky lady's gift, he called it. Reminder of what kept me alive. He displayed it on his desk for 50 years, a small piece of steel that told a story most people could not understand. When visitors asked about it, he would explain briefly the tank, the armor, the rounds that could not kill them. Then he would change the subject because the war was over and there was no need to dwell. But at night, sometimes, he would pick up the fragment and feel its weight, its roughness, the slight curl where the shell had deformed the surface. He would remember the heat of the desert, the noise of the engines, the faces of many he had served with and lost. And he would think about what it meant to climb into a machine that promised to protect you, to trust your life to 78mm of steel, to survive because someone, somewhere, had calculated correctly. We weren't brave, he wrote in his memoirs, published privately in 1987. We were just lucky. Lucky to have a tank that did what it was supposed to do. Lucky to come home. If this story has moved you, if it has shown you something about war and engineering and human endurance that you did not expect, subscribe, because these stories deserve to be remembered. The Matilda's legacy is not measured in victories or territories conquered. It is measured in men who came home, in lessons learned, in the quiet understanding that survival is its own form of triumph. The tank was slow, unglamorous, and ultimately obsolete. But for 2 years, in the deserts of North Africa and the field of France, it was a difference between life and death. German gunners fired at it and watched their shells bounce away. Italian soldiers surrendered rather than face it. British crews trusted it with their lives and were not betrayed. The armor held. That is what the Matilda was. That is what it meant. The war taught them violence. The tank taught them that sometimes surviving was enough,